Welcome to the very first recording of Lost Women of Science in front of an audience. We're here by kind invitation of The Hearth, a London-based women's co-working and well-being space. For those of you new to Lost Women of Science, it's a podcast that tells the stories of forgotten female scientists who never got the recognition they deserved. And I'm your host, Rosie Millard. Now, this episode is part of the series Lost Women of Science Conversations, where we talk to writers, poets and artists who make forgotten female scientists their subjects. And today we're going to focus on opera. Now, we often say that for every Marie Curie or Rosalind Franklin, there are hundreds of female scientists who remain completely unknown. So you might be wondering why we are devoting this episode to Rosalind Franklin. But today we're going to be talking about her in a new context as a subject of an opera. And I'm delighted to welcome the composer of Rosalind the opera, Peter Hugh White, and the librettist, Clare Heath, who are going to tell us why her story makes such a great subject. So welcome Peter Hugh White. Peter is a composer and was for many years director of music at the Royal Grammar School in Guildford. His choral music has been performed extensively in the UK and abroad and has been recorded by the choirs of Christ Church and Trinity College, Oxford. And welcome to Dr. Clare Heath. Clare is a retired GP and granddaughter of Sir Lawrence Bragg, head of the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge, where Watson and Crick worked. Clare, you've never written a libretto before. Why did you suddenly embark on this? And why an opera to tell the story of Rosalind?
That's a very good question. I'm fascinated by the story of Rosalind Franklin from an early age because of the book, The Double Helix, which portrays someone who, when you go on to discover a little bit more about Rosalind Franklin, is completely unrecognisable.
Who wrote the book?
James Watson, absolutely.
Who with
went
Francis
on to
Crick.
discover jointly the shape of DNA. But the story in the Double Helix is of a difficult, trying woman. And when you read a little bit more about her and the other biographies, you realize that Rosalind Franklin was herself an extraordinary, brilliant scientist, not in any way a downtrodden victim. She had fantastic interests in all kinds of other things. She was very capable, very clever.
But it was Watson and Crick who went on to get
Watson
global fame, Nobel Prizes.
Well, that was because Rosalind Franklin died before the Nobel Prize was awarded. Her work was not credited to her in the Nobel speech. I think now people know that she was very involved.
How old was she when she died?
She was 37. She died of ovarian cancer.
So young. I mean, so the glories that could have come her way were denied.
The day after she died was the day when she would have been announcing to an international conference her work on the tobacco mosaic virus, which was extraordinary, and that in itself would have probably got her a Nobel Prize.
So, Peter, why opera? Why is opera the best vehicle for this?
Well, in some ways, I mean, I think when I go to the opera, and when it's really working, I call it just kind of super reality. You go through a curtain, and despite the fact that it's one of the most sort of artificial art forms you can imagine.
Yeah, quite bonkers art.
Bonkers art form. And yet, when it works, you are transported absolutely. The music, if it works well, almost it bypasses the brain. I know it brings a different dynamic. And I'd had some doubts after initially being so excited about the project. I had some doubts as to whether this story was sufficiently operatic. You know, there's no love affairs, no murders, but the elements actually for a really good operatic story were there. There's the suspicion, betrayal, jeopardy, all sorts of things. The sort of core of any good opera. And the more I read about it and the more I learned about it, the more I felt this is this is the perfect operatic story. And in some ways, it's such an intensely, it's almost a psychodrama. And I feel the music helps to just focus very much onto these sort of chess pieces that are moving in this story.
All right, well, let's hear some music. And here, our first clip tonight. And in our first clip, here we have Sir Lawrence Bragg, Clare's grandfather, introducing the story of the discovery of the structure of DNA.
It was, of course, a major event of scientific interest, yes, but also an historic contribution to human knowledge. It is a story of the researcher's struggle, of doubts and final triumph, and the poignant dilemma. Would cooperation be seen as trespass? Did the idea come only to me? Or unconsciously did I learn it elsewhere? Or worse perhaps, were actions deliberate?
Well, Peter Hugh White, that is a clip from the opera performed there by the National Opera Studio. Yeah. How did you try and convey the difficult, the very mathematical subject that you were embarking on in music? What was your approach?
Well, I don't think I ever really thought this is about maths, this is about science, and I would sort of therefore construct music that reflected those qualities. It was more really for me a fascinating story about a group of very disparate people. They're a splendid cast for any opera. They're so different. Watson, brash, sort of firing on all cylinders, chaotic to a certain extent, and Crick working with him at Cambridge. And then King's, Wilkins, sort of much more withdrawn. And
explain who Wilkins is.
Maurice Wilkins was working on X-ray crystallography at King's, and I suppose at the Randall Institute, and where Rosalind was invited to come and join the team. And she came to King's, but at the time that she was sort of put in place, I think Maurice Wilkins was away, and he never quite grasped what his relationship with Rosalind was going to be. Am I right, Claire?
Claire?
Very nearly, I would say. The Randall Institute wasn't the Randall Institute then, it was John Randall who was in charge at King's at the time.
Yes.
And he'd had a good war, he was successful, he was a good physicist, but he somehow managed to misrepresent what Rosalind Franklin was going to do to Wilkins, and they never quite found their equilibrium, to say the very least.
No, so you've got these very strong characteristics in these in the sort of players in this opera, and so from a musical point of view, it was a gift really that as each personality developed in my mind, the music sort of presented itself. I mean, Wilkins, the music is generally anxious, nervous. There's a deal of syncopation, and the harmonies are rather opaque. And then if I look at Watson, and when Watson and Crick are working together, I err towards the major. I don't really write major-minor music, but there's a sense of it much more flamboyant.
So it's a sort of leitmotif, perhaps, for each
Yes.
character.
Not exactly leitmotifs, but yes, they're, as each person sings, the music tends to reflect their character. And as you listen to the opera, I think you would be able to anticipate who was going to sing next, even if it wasn't through a leitmotif as such.
Claire, you remember your grandfather, and he was obviously crucial at the whole time, the race to discover DNA. Can you explain for our listeners why DNA was so crucial. It's a term we bandy around now, but then, back in the day...
Well, DNA had been discovered, found, whatever. Initially, they thought that it was a protein. It was found to be the stuff of genes, the stuff of heredity. And
backbone of life itself.
well, exactly. And no one quite understood what it was, how it could reproduce itself, so easily and quickly. And there was a sort of gradual build-up to finding it. Certain things were noticed about it, and there was Avery who noticed that there was this symmetry in the base pairs. Is that right? And it was the obvious next discovery. That time in physics and microbiology, everything was suddenly becoming apparent. There was this terrific sort of new birth, discovery, and DNA was the prize. Everyone wanted to do that. In America, Pauling was chasing it. In England, there was the Cavendish, and then there was King's. And Cavendish and King's were using different techniques.
But even though there'd just been a war, I mean, we're
exactly, and that's what's so incredibly exciting. This is the 50s. This is
rationing still going on.
This is well, exactly, and rationing's still going on, and yet there's a rebirth. There's an excitement, and people were doing fantastic things in the physical sciences.
But Rosalind is still working in a dismal laboratory underground.
Well,
let's hear our next clip, which is where she's going to be singing of her difficulties and the gloomy surroundings in which she is forced to work. Claire, you're smiling as you're listening to those words. I'm astounded that you've never written a libretto before, and here you are having knocked out a full-scale opera.
There's two things there. One is that for the words, I tried as often as possible to go back to actual letters, actual things that were almost quoting from either Rosalind or from Watson and Crick, and that I found very helpful. Peter then battered them about to make them a little bit more singable.
Squeeze them around a bit.
What I want to know, though, is her story one of sort of men ganging up against her?
No, what I'm trying to tell in the story is one of a brilliant scientist who somehow got left out of the story. And the men didn't gang up any more than anyone else would have done at the time, I don't think. King's at that time did have quite a few women, but in the senior common room, I don't think women were allowed in for lunch, for instance.
In some ways, Rosalind was the most difficult character to portray because we know that she was gregarious, fun, outdoorsy. She was a lovely person. I think she had a wonderful time in Paris. But there's no doubt that the combination of circumstances at King's led her to be having a very difficult time.
Why was she known as the Dark Lady?
That came from a letter, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but that Maurice Wilkins wrote to Watson, describing her as our Dark Lady. And I think it was just before she moved on to Birkbeck. Because by then relationships had really broken down.
All right, well, that's a great moment to listen to our next clip, which is we'll hear Maurice Wilkins, who was Rosalind's boss, and as you say, who had a difficult relationship with her, singing of how hard he finds it to work with this brilliant woman.
Just a few steps away, but it could be 1,000 miles. Her eyes transfixed, but her elusive fleeting smiles transmits no warmth. We pass, suspicious and attracted. I had thought she would be my assistant, but no, hers is the authority. Her brilliance eclipses my dull flicker of my faltering steps.
Do either of you feel a kind of ethical obligation to represent Rosalind in a different way?
I think that's a really good question, and I did show the original libretto to her sister, Jennifer Glynn, who lives in Cambridge, still alive, very much, quite senior now, because I was very worried. I didn't want to add to the pile of insults to this already over-maligned woman scientist. I had fewer qualms about some of the other characters, but I hope I haven't maligned any of them too much. I wanted to present as near as I could to what actually had happened.
Yeah, I think we took care, didn't we, to make sure that you didn't sort of there were some bandwagons perhaps going around about how Rosalind was treated, and the sort of feminist drum is banged, and we didn't want that to happen, because I think Rosalind herself, I think she celebrated almost when Crick and Watson finally got it. I think we've talked about there being a race, and certainly there was. Crick and Watson were damn sure they were in a race, but I don't think Rosalind was. I think she was just quietly pursuing, and very carefully and diligently and with discipline.
So why did it matter that she was left out of the great plaudits?
In a sense, Clare and I were talking about this beforehand, and in a sense, the moment of truth, I think, is probably the reception speech by Watson.
Can you explain the reception of what?
For the Nobel Prize, which I think was in 1963, is that right?
63, it was after she died. So at the Nobel reception, it was Watson who stood up to make the acceptance speech on behalf of all three, and as he said, but the words are his own, and he unfortunately failed to mention by name Rosalind Franklin. He made the speech on behalf of Francis Crick and of Maurice Wilkins and for himself, but he didn't say, and it is with great regret that we haven't also...
It seems extraordinary to me also that Maurice Wilkins was there, and that he didn't bring to the attention of what's Crick and Watson that Rosalind had played such an important
Now, critically, and I think we have an image of photograph 51 here, which is the famous photograph where Rosalind realizes the double helix nature of DNA. Can you explain this?
For a start, I always imagined we were looking down the barrel of a gun at the double helix. No, it's from the side. And to an X-ray crystallographer looking at this, you can see that it is a helix, but that it's also a double helix with strands going counterbalancing to each other. And you can see it by what's not there in the way that the strands spiral around.
I mean, to the untrained eye, and for people who are listening, it looks like an X made up by dots.
Well, this is the process of X-ray diffraction, where you shine X-rays at a crystal. And originally, von Lau, early 20th century scientist, noted that if you do that, they beam off in a particular way. They diffract. And then from that, the Braggs, went on to actually work out the formula for that. And using that formula, suddenly there was a whole new world of smaller things you could look at. And two X-ray crystallographers, and it's a specialist art, they can look at a picture like this and immediately say, oh, helix. But more than that, it's the fact of the pairing in it of base pairs, which everyone knew existed, but they couldn't work out how it could be.
And how long did this photograph take to make?
I think it was about 60 hours or so. And indeed, I think there was a power cut in the middle of this process. So we can't be exactly sure how many hours it was exposed, but it was a long time.
Can you talk us through the betrayal surrounding photograph 51?
Photograph 51, the sort of double helix story, if you like, is that it was, stolen from her room and shown illicitly. This isn't quite correct. Rosalind was going to leave. Her work had moved on to Maurice Wilkins' desk. It was absolutely fine for him to do what he would with it. However, he should have said that he'd shown it, and he should have acknowledged it, and he should have asked consent. That would have been fairer.
So can we say with certainty that were it not for this photograph taken by Rosalind Franklin, the true nature of DNA would not have been arrived at?
It wouldn't have been arrived at by Crick and Watson then. It would certainly have been arrived at because it was there and someone would have seen it. But this photograph helped them hugely in making their successful structure, and it was the lack of recognition that was so terribly sad. Yeah.
So this is a perfect moment to listen to Maurice Wilkins, Rosalind's boss, showing James Watson photograph 51.
They were looking at a photograph, number 51. She and Rosalind were working on it. I think it might be important. They were looking, but not saying. Here, this is the one.
And here's Watson's response. He's astonished at what he's looking at.
My God, Wilkins, why didn't we see it? It's so clear, so beautiful. Why did we miss it? Oh God, it takes your breath away. So simple, so perfect, and it is a helix. Pauline thought it might be. This is a revelation.
So here we have Rosalind Franklin, Cambridge University, PhD from Cambridge in 1945. Worked in Paris, as you said, worked at King's, worked at Birkbeck, critical work in the definition of DNA, and dead at 37.
It's
a story of what if, isn't
Absolutely
it?
tragic.
Well, I think it's what if, but she's achieved the most fantastic amount, and this is supposed to be really a celebration, not a disappointment.
There are some serious experts I know in this room, people who are very familiar with the whole story. Are there any questions you would like to ask either to Peter or Claire?
Rosalind was my father's younger sister, so my name's Nigel Franklin. And I would like
Actual
to...
relation, I mean, that's
Yes,
terrific.
yes. I knew Rosalind as a child, and she died when I was 7 years old. But and I'd like to say thank you for doing this wonderful work. I think it's important to know that Rosalind was well known within the science world when she was alive, and it wasn't kind of quite like she died very soon after she stopped working on DNA and went to But I mean, she left in 53-ish, and she then went. She died in 58, so it was 5 years, and she was a noted authority. I mean, the model had been made, but she was lecturing around the world on viruses and indeed more than virus, quite apart from the work with DNA, which is 2 years of her life, which is probably the least happy time of her life, but the time that she's most famous for.
Okay, any other questions?
Hello, thank you for a really fascinating talk. Couple of questions. I'm still not clear how you went from being a GP to writing a libretto for an opera.
Nor am I.
Wonderful. There must have been an inspiration somewhere. And then also how the two of you met each other and it got turned into a opera.
We went on a long walk together, Peter and I said, there is this wonderful story, and I think it would make a fantastic opera. And Peter, being, a schoolmaster and quick, said, well, I'll write it. And I am terribly lazy and busy as a GP then, and didn't. And he kept saying, well, why haven't you? I mean, where is it? Come on. And actually, just before lockdown, we really got going on it. But don't you get a sort of, ear thing story that you've simply got to tell? And
But one more question.
Thank you so much for the talk, both of you. That was really interesting. I guess, you mentioned how Rosalind Franklin lived this really rich and interesting life. How did you decide, I guess, which scenes to include in the opera so that you could tell not just the story of what happened, but also characterize these really interesting people in the opera?
That's an interesting question, because I found it quite hard to decide, but I was telling the story of her as a brilliant scientist in this particular context. So I read all around about her wonderful alpine holidays and her friends and going off to Canada and all kinds of other areas of her life, but I couldn't fit them in to 4 rooms in the way that this opera needs to.
Well, let's listen to the final chorus from the opera to finish the story on a musical note. Here, Rosalind appears as a spectre at the Nobel Prize ceremony and joins with Watson, Crick and Wilkins in celebrating their discovery. She sings, "Such separate strands but intertwined, we found the key to humankind." And then all the singers end with, "And renowned be thy grave." Wonderful. Well, the opera is going to be performed at King's College, London, next spring.
Meters away from the laboratory she worked in, which is rather wonderful.
And possibly in Cambridge too.
We hope very much that it will be going on in Cambridge as well. So we're really excited about the possibility of a second performance up there.